Hi, Mage fans. This is your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. And I just wanted to go over some introductory notes on today's episode about how to storytell romance in RPGs. I wanted to do the topic of RPG romance because I find characters often have one of two romantic backgrounds. They emerge from this formless void with no concept of romance, intimacy, or sexuality, and those elements never enter gameplay. Or they've had one romantic relationship in the past, and it broke in some way, often as a variant of the dead girlfriend in a refrigerator syndrome. Probably about 4 years ago, I ran a game where I mentioned to a player, is it okay if this NPC were into you? And it's up to you the direction that would take if you want to do that. After this player had confidently had their character face life or death decisions regularly about sacrificing themselves to save the city, the question of, can this mortal with death sight have a crush on you, stunned them into absolute silence. They weren't sure how they would respond, what their character would do, what the Cabal would think, how their spirit mentor would respond, and a remarkable number of other questions that to me would just be resolved in roleplay. And in that moment, I realized that at least for my table and with these players, something more formal would probably be necessary if I wanted romance to be part of the game. Part of the reason I like Invisible Sun, take a drink, is that the game treats avenge your fallen friend, go on a first date, and fall to the outer darkness with equal narrative weight. So it reinforces that romantic choices are legitimate narrative choices without really providing a framework or how they should be introduced, but it did at least provide a couple of the key beats. Then I saw the crowdfunding campaign for GMing romance, and I was pleased that it offered a more complete system. It has the serenade system, it has the gift system, it has the romance tracking system, and a basic outlines of questions at each step in each of those processes, and a link to the basic introduction is in the show notes. So like our episode on Our Brilliant Ruin, if you don't like it, it costs $0, at least for the preview. There's also a link to the Backerkit if you would like to backlate, which I wound up doing. I'll do a quick overview of it now because the interview is pretty general. As with many narrative systems, step 0 is to make sure everyone at the table is okay with something. The storyteller needs to at least have one romanceable NPC, which is a character with defined or soon-to-be definable attributes like personal values, likes, dislikes, desires, and limits. One aspect of romance is getting to know those things, and an ST should have some idea of what they are ahead of time. The NPC should have secrets, which is lore only they initially know that can be discovered in play. So there should be things your character doesn't already know about the other character. We get advice on completing a romance sheet, which is like a living document kind of tracking the relationship and its key moments, keeping track of what the NPC knows and what the GM knows. This I thought was interesting in that in urban fantasy, we can cleave relationships kind of into those that involved those who know what's weird about the other person and those where they don't. Two mages dating may involve both of them going, okay, you get this aspect of me, i.e. being a mage. Or it may be a cloak and dagger game of keeping your mage life hidden. Maybe a mage does significant work to clear their resonance, have a mental shield up, or prevent paradox accumulation as to not tip their hand. Alternatively, it could be a mage and a non-mage, and if the non-mage is an NPC, how do they make sense of things like resonance, or paradox flaws, or quiet, or having a familiar, or magic, and other just plain weird things that a mage emits into the world outside of dynamic magic? What if a mage is obviously involved with another supernatural type, and both agree simply not to talk about it? I know couples who are from different political parties or even have very heated sports team rivalries, and they just choose not to bring it up. The first of the relationship steps is the first sparks. Once someone has indicated they want romance to happen or has agreed to have romance happen to them, the first sparks is a moment where narratively meaningful first opportunity for something to happen occurs. The book also has a flirting system, not in the preview, but that sounds kind of cool. This is the moment where the character possibly in retrospect realizes that they may be interested, and two questions become, how did the revelation hit you? And what emotions flood your experience? Putting a mate spin on it, does magic get involved? Does the familiar or sentient wonder notice before the character does? Maybe the realization cross factional lines. Does your traditionalist find the NWO gray suit really gets their motor running? Do they do anything notable like use mind to bottle the moment and turn it aside or store it for later? Or do they use time to relive that moment? The text then has recommended questions for if the revelation is in person or occurs later. The next steps are dates, which are an opportunity to spend time with the character, and this being a mage, a date could include sparring practice, raiding a node together, a technocratic debrief, curdomane, or something we traditionally call a date. The book asks then what your character does to prepare. I imagine most mages have some sort of extended magical casting ability, implying some sort of ritual. What does then that date look like for a mage? in terms of preparation. I imagine the follower spends hours preparing themselves as they likely normally do. A prayer to Hathor or Venus or Saint Raphael may be invoked for another character, while another may just be excited to take a break from chantry politics. Anyway, the free preview again has a bunch of good questions, and while not complete, is a great introduction for romance in your games. And with that, here's the interview with Friday, Stout and Sebastian Yūe. This is on romance and intimacy, and we do talk briefly about the existence of the sex, and use the F word as a verb a few times, and I don't bleep it. Also, this episode was edited while my editing arm was in a brace due to an injury I received retrieving a copy of pre-first edition Mage. Also, one final reminder that in September, we'll be switching to episodes every other week as Mage the Podcast tries to build up our production capacity for video. As always, I'll share any developments as they happen. And with that, on with the show. Hi, Mage fans. It's your host, Terry Robinson with Mage the Podcast. Joining me today are two game designers, Sebastian Yūe and Friday Stout, and we are talking about a recently ended Backerkit project, crowdfunding project called How to GM Romance. And of the things that can happen in real life that are also things that can happen in games, I feel confident in saying that reasonable portrayals of interpersonal dynamics regarding love and romance are probably one of the least well-developed areas of gaming technology. So when I saw this project, I'm like, holy dink, they're finally doing it. And Maids of the Ascension being an urban fantasy game, we do deal with the weird scenario of what happens when the vampire falls in love with the mummy. And hopefully through the totality of time, Sebastian and Friday will be able to kind of help answer that question, or at least point us in the right direction. Sebastian, Friday, how you doing?
Good, thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Oh, gladly.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I got my water. I'm prepared to talk for an hour or however long we do this.
That is a technically accurate response, which I appreciate. Like, yes, I am prepared to do the thing that I signed up to do. Friday, what was the GMing romance project, and kind of what were your core goals?
Yeah, so I started as a stream GM. I had kind of learned it on the fly because I wanted to be involved in like the theater kid movement with actual plays and such. And that was kind of my reconnection to this. I'd done some role playing growing up a little bit. I did a little bit of vampire pen and paper. But a lot of my role playing was really done through a text medium for a long time, and maybe some of your listeners will appreciate a throwback to like MUDs, Multi-User Dungeons, the original MMO. So that's how I got started with the most of my role playing. And one of the things that always kind of struck me as odd in that transition from MUDs and things like that to role playing with people at the table or over Zoom call at the table was that there was so much reticence about romance in general, and especially people that wanted to or appreciated it in their media, but then couldn't see themselves in any way partaking in it. Or if they did, then they were just terrified of making people uncomfortable or doing something quote unquote weird or like being like kind of predatory or whatever, because we've all like read r/RPG horror stories. So it's just one of those things where it's like, I would rather not be on RPG horror stories, and people are afraid of what they don't know. So when I started to work with Kiana Shaw on a different project, I got to chatting with her about her work on the safety toolkit, and she came in to do some narrative design for me on my other project, Vineyard. And one of the things that I always had in mind was doing something like this because I love romance and I wanted to incorporate it in some way. I think there's a lot of beneficial things for players to enjoy about it. And anything from a very PG, like, this is your wife, go find things for your wife and bring them back to her kind of role-playing environment, to like everything from an involved dating scene or anything like that. I was really wanting to be able to bring that to a wider audience because there is a definite hunger for it, as long as you can get past the initial, like, there is a guaranteed outcome for this. And that is not what romance is, just like any other role-playing game that we have. And that's the biggest hurdle to get people interested in something like this, is saying that romance is not just sex. It can be a great number of things, and being open to the possibility of introducing to people to a more nuanced approach to it, and then giving them the tools to be able to do it well enough that they're comfortable and they'll try it out, and they'll also make their players feel comfortable enough to try it out. That's really what the project is about.
And Sebastian, what are your thoughts? What about this project spoke to you?
Well, first of all, I was really attracted to the idea of facilitating romances at other people's tables because, likewise, I really enjoy romance in my RPGs. And the idea is to give GMs who might be more hesitant or nervous or unsure, or just GMs who have never tried to implement romance at their tables, like a framework to do that. So there are several chapters to this book, and mine is a system to kind of track your approval essentially with an NPC, and like it gives you like a kind of second character sheet with romance as its focus. It's a sheet with character details on it, but it's focused for romance, and so there's a dimension to that character that you wouldn't necessarily see, and so it walks you through, like, as the GM, ways to convey NPC feelings and attitudes towards the character. And so it's like there are guidelines on how to do, like, how to role play that as well as a kind of mechanized system. But essentially, yeah, I was just really excited about helping other folks to use romance in their games.
And why, Sebastian, do you think that romance is so common in our lives, but so seemingly rare in our gaming lives?
I think that it really depends on the context. I know that Friday's background is, stream GMing and pro GMing, and it means that necessarily she's not always going to be playing with a table that she knows right away. But for people who've been playing together for a while, and you and your friends and your gaming group, then you might not necessarily need something like this. But if romance is something you want to explore, and it's not necessarily people who you know very well, then this is the ideal thing. And so I think that there's a level of awkwardness. Like it's like, I'm going to sit opposite my friend and kind of maybe like we're going to pretend to flirt with each other. And it really does depend on people's different comfort levels and how they've established that relationship and what kinds of conversations they've had going into the role play. So because it is, like, I understand that it is an awkward thing to do, to think about, but hopefully this book will help facilitate those conversations that need to happen before you go into GMing romance.
It seems to be the case that people are hesitant to roleplay something that they themselves don't understand. And I know in modernity, a fair number of us have either fallen backwards into love, or it has been a case of propinquity that we develop relationships with people nearby us, or we're in the modern contrivance of dealing with something like online dating, which a game may not have an analog to. Your swords and sorcery game probably doesn't have an OkCupid.
Yeah, I think there's a degree of also like the vulnerability of doing romance there, like, because it requires a very deep kind of interpersonal connection, whether that's you as a person or your character. And I think that adds an extra layer of like, that's just another layer to navigate, essentially. Like, the role playing is already kind of a vulnerable time, and then when you have to think about it and become like an entirely different character, and like, there's a degree of, how much of my own person am I putting into this character, and like there also might be for some people a degree of like, are people going to like look at this character and think that I am also into the things that the character is into, and that kind of stuff. So I'd say that too.
Yeah, one of the things that I want to say about that is that all of the relationships that we have, and I believe that I have had to navigate these at a faster pace than a normal table because I'm a pro GM, so I do have strangers at my table often. It's good to have a formalized structure in place to let people know, this is what I'm going to do. These are the rules of the table. This is the culture of how I approach romance. This is what I will never do. This is how I will gain your consent for something like this before I run a story along these lines, before I introduce something that is going to be like potentially putting you in a vulnerable spot. I'm going to let you know. And building trust with other people in that way to respect them and let them know that they're respected and that you're going to honor their decisions and their agency, even though they're being vulnerable in front of you and other people, is one of the most important things you can do to open the door to romance, because that is normally something that we in our lives don't open up to everyone.
So, Friday, you're a professional GM. Notionally, you've probably played a fair number of games. Sebastian, your name has been attached to any number of RPG properties. What, before this project, was kind of the state of play? If you were to describe what the role-playing technologies, because ultimately that's what they are tools that allow us to do a thing that we want better than if they weren't there. What technologies kind of existed? Like when you did your literature search, what things were particularly inspirational? Or did you go, hey, this is an interesting starting point, we need to go from there? Friday, what did you see as kind of being the state of play for romance in games before you started this Backerkit?
There wasn't a lot. There is a very kind of, I would say, outdated, unofficial Dungeons and Dragons module from the early 2000s about sex. There is Thirsty Sword Lesbians is a great system that deals with queer romance, but I find that a lot of the time, and this is my personal experience and my perspective on it, but it can be difficult to get people to want to play Thirsty Sword Lesbians because they think that if they don't belong to the community, then it's not for them. And for the same reason that if you present something as made by queers or whatever group, then they will just assume that it's not for them if they don't belong necessarily. So I think we do have a lot of queerness in How to GM Romance because the team is very queer. But there is like some degree of new ground, I think, for the book itself that I have seen in the industry. There's not a lot out there because it's considered to be very taboo. There's this Puritan stance, I think, in a lot of ways about it, that people don't even want to touch it because they're afraid of the backlash, the hack and slash community of yesteryear that presumes that any sort of involvement in romance really comes down to like predation and perversion, which is really not the case. We have romance in all of our media. You know what I mean? It's really just a matter of enabling it in a safe way with your friends, which you may not know how to do because maybe you're not a professional GM and you haven't practiced. Maybe you're just like, it's a side project. It's like something you do in your spare time. Maybe you're doing it with your family or your friends, and having a resource is great. There just hasn't been a resource out there that I think addresses a lot of the issues of getting to that level of comfort to where you can say, I know what to do. I know how to present this in a way that people are going to be receptive to it and try it out if they want to. And what I have found a lot of the time with strangers at my table is that after playing together for a month or two, they ain't strangers anymore. And what once was, if they are initially interested in like doing romance, it starts off as very cheap. It starts off as very like joking or, you know, kind of pithy comments or, you know, I make a joke of it. But the deeper they get into the campaign, the more romantic they get because their trust has been built between the people at the table and between the player and me. And they're more open to either dating an NPC or dating another player character at the table because I have set the stage and I have made it so that they feel safe to do so.
I think for me in literature search, I found that a lot of like it's very well explored in the indie scene. And there's been games where romance is the focus. I mean, the most famous example perhaps is, you know, Emily Care Boss's romance trilogy, which I see, yeah, you're familiar with that. And more recent releases, you know, such as Starcrossed, like we have Alex Roberts designing an intimacy system for us for this project. And so she is the designer of Starcrossed. It's a really good game. It uses like a Jenga tower to tell a story of these characters who want to be together, but for whatever reason they can't be. And there are other kind of games that do have romance as a prominent aspect, like Apocalypse Keys and Monster Hearts. Like being queer and the aspect of queer romance is especially important to those games. And I've also found that in the live action roleplay scene, like, you know, there's a game called Let These Mermaids Touch Your Dick, maybe. It's a really good game. It's really interesting. And so like you know, looking to that scene, like there's actually a lot to play with. And there are some really interesting ways that indie designers are interpreting romance and having it at their tables. But I think that that like the space that this book particularly occupies is if you were playing perhaps a more traditional game, like if you're playing D&D, like how do you integrate romance alongside D&D, where it might not necessarily be the focus of your story, but you still want it to be important. And so that kind of is where I see this product being.
Thank you for answering that way better than me, Sebastian. That was...
I mean, I feel like you could retitle this project GMing Romance Hets Can Fuck Too, because it is that weird case where the queer community has been so out in front. And I would argue this is partially because of Dan Savage's thesis that in heteronormative relationships, there is a default. There is a set of societal defaults that kind of direct action. But the moment you step outside of it, you don't have that automatic societal playbook to go through. So you have to say, what do you want? What's your thing? And to me, at the role-playing table, that is arguably the moment of greatest vulnerability. As a storyteller, when your character has the limelight, what does that look like? That is a strangely intimate moment where some people want to just roll all the dice. Other people want to be integral to the solution. Other people want to swing the battle axe. And everyone has a different notion of kind of their character having the limelight. And likewise with romance, we all have a different notion of this is a relationship at its best. Sometimes for some people, it's two people that have absolutely amazing badinage. And for other people, it is having access to emotional support. And building that into a game is, to understate it, kind of non-trivial. And with that, Sebastian, what do you feel the most common pitfalls are when people have tried to introduce romance into a story?
Yeah, I think as Friday said, like trying to force a romance, because actually like in the best romances that I have experienced in tabletop, like I didn't like none of us involved went into it thinking we are going to do a romance. It just sort of happened. And again, like also as Friday said, it did start as a joke. Like my friend and I, we realized that we made a couple of characters that have very overlapping interests. And we were like, hey, wouldn't it be funny if if they fucked one time? And so we started writing a short story about that. And then we were like, hey, but we've put so much work into this, like that actually, this situation actually could happen. Like we wrote it for the meme, like, but essentially like, yeah, trying to force the romance is like it won't feel natural, and you kind of have to like, if you want to do a romance, you kind of have to take a few steps back and think, well, what does my character want, what are they likely to respond to, and then kind of set up these situations that feel natural for the story, as opposed to going into it and being like, well, my character is here and I'm standing around looking for someone to date. Like that's not, yeah.
And there seems to be this weird way in which romance and like damnation are both things where the player may choose to have it occur, but the character may be unaware of it, that they are on those first kind of initial steps. Friday, when you surveyed the gaming scene, what did you see as being kind of the errors and mistakes that people were making that you kind of wanted to correct?
I think the biggest thing is really assuming consent and punishing players for withdrawing consent are the biggest pitfalls that I have witnessed. And I've had some really unfortunate experiences with that, because a lot of the time it's just one of those things where it's like the person is uncomfortable with having the conversation about consent, therefore consent is assumed, which I think having the structure of this conversation around like a system, a book, that helps you have that conversation makes everything a lot easier. And one of the things that and I've done romance in a big variety of different games, most of which are not specifically designed for romance, but I've also just run straight erotica games before because people paid me for that. So, and it's one of those things where it's like, you send them a consent form, you send them a form like, what are you looking for out of this? And the biggest thing for me was always, what is the experience that you were personally looking for? And if they came back to me with something that I wasn't comfortable with, then I would just tell them that. And then I would move on to the next thing. Because if I'm going to make myself uncomfortable by doing something, then that's not necessarily a good experience for either of us. And making sure that I have a very clear picture about what they want the actual gameplay experience to be with it is very important. And then also you have to ask your table as well. So it's like, it's more of a dynamic conversation that I think people are prepared for. It can be a tricky thing to navigate, but if you have a structure in place, or you have like a questionnaire, you have something that you can build from, it makes it a lot easier, because some people will say no to romance based on an assumption they made based around consent. Because they think that romance, if it's included in the game, it's going to dominate the entire session, which is usually not the case. It's normally like, hey, can I have like a scene once in a while with someone that I have really wanted to integrate into my character development? And then a lot of the time, if the table is really invested in each other's characters, they really want to see that scene too anyway. So they want to see that date. They want to spy on that date. They want to like, help them out or do something for them and see that story progress. Because as we get to different types of games and more, I guess, non-wargaming games where there is more dynamic outcomes than killing or being killed, I think that's really where something like romance shines. It allows you to explore a different aspect of your character that makes it more rewarding in a lot of ways.
I feel like people are thrown off by the fact that romance is not zero sum. There can be this wonderful and beautiful thing that is added to the game that does not require something to be taken away. For my paladin to triumph over your orc, one has to lose, the other has to succeed. And ideally, that is not how romance works. Sebastian, what to you are kind of some of the unique aspects of romance that can be added to an RPG as they play out? What makes romance kind of different from a normative sense than the narratives that have been traditionally baked into a tabletop role-playing game?
Yeah, I think it's not so much how it is different, but so much as, more how, like, what does this traditional situation look like when romance is involved? Like, one of my very favorite things to do actually in a romance, if I'm, say, playing D&D, is I love to do combat when a romance is happening because, because then you can ask yourself, like, well, how does this relationship affect the way that my character is behaving in battle? Like, is he going to, forget the mission and focus on trying to save his partner? Or, like, is she going to, like, what happens if the partner dies? Like, suddenly does she have to yell at the cleric's god to bring him back? Like, there are all sorts of situations that, like, the stakes are different. Like, there are all sorts of ways to show that relationship through the system. So that's something that I really enjoy doing.
And Friday, what to you were kind of the unique aspects of romance and relationships? What is that extra dimension that we get to add to our games?
I love breaking up with players. As long as they're consenting. It's just one of those things where it's like, I think it just depends on like the table and the players, but I like that you can add some dimension to the table's favorite NPC. Because when I've run Curse of Strahd 12,000 times, inevitably someone tries to date Irina. Like it's inevitable. So for me to not be prepared to have Irina open to that it doesn't ruin the game, but I get a much fuller game if I have Irina open to dating whomever it is that shows interest, right? Part of that, if you're unfamiliar with Curse of Strahd, light spoilers for this 30-year-old module, Irina is someone that is, basically for content and trigger warnings, is taken advantage of by this powerful vampire and is sort of written in as basically just the love interest of the vampire initially. And I think there are alternative versions now that I have participated in, like She is the Ancient, that really kind of make her out to be a stronger character and more interesting and has her own agency and things like that. And when you introduce love interests as having agency and then also able to contribute to the party in a meaningful way that makes them fun to be around, that is a dynamic that I think makes for a fuller experience. And I've had some unfortunate things come of that, and I've had some really great things come of that. Like, for instance, I've had someone that was in love with Irina try to save Irina in a battle and end up just getting killed herself as well as Irina. And that was probably one of the most like heartbreaking things that happened at the table. It was still a great scene and something that I'll remember forever, but it was, it's one of those things that you just don't get without it. And it's a different type of investment, I think. One of the things that I really enjoy about romance, as far as like exploring with NPCs, is that aspect. But also for players, if you get two players who are comfortable enough with each other to explore it at your table, they end up coming up with some of the most interesting stuff to do together, I think, that is not sexually related, I think, a lot of the time. Because then you have two characters who want a future together and beyond adventuring, beyond like whatever situation that they're currently in. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of role playing is like imagining if these two characters have a future beyond the table, beyond the story that we're going to tell here. I think that's great.
So it kind of seems to be that there are two aspects of that additional dimensionality. One, it adds something intimate to the mundane. For instance, two characters will almost never argue about the placement of the bowls in a dishwasher, but that is a discussion that occurs regularly in people who are partnered. Two, it changes the motivations, as you mentioned. Suddenly, tactically preserving the paladin may be the best move to make sure that we can take down the mind flayer, but I'm not married to the paladin.
Yeah.
Thinking through games, it is hard to discuss games without thinking of the granddaddy in terms of being Dungeons and or Dragons. And one of the difficult things about D&D as a setting that has been inherited by other games is it is not here, it is not now. Part of the fun of an F20 fantasy game is we get to apply different mores and beliefs to it, but one of the difficulties is we need to apply different mores and different beliefs to it. Sebastian, it seems like the process of thinking of romance through the lens of another culture or another time is fraught. How do we do that? Do you have any advice for how to adjust play to include or balance a culture that may have different sensibilities? Or alternatively, do we just do the thing that we frequently do and say, yes, this is roughly 13th century Europe, but we're going to apply modern sensibilities to it?
Yeah, I think that really depends on you on your table. Like, that's something that you would discuss, like, if you want to translate the social norms of the 13th century. I mean, and honestly, I am not well versed enough in history to actually know what those norms are. So, like medieval peasants were definitely fucking. Like, I just,
Yeah.
like, but I don't know I don't know the details of that. But I think that it really depends on how you do that. But if you're interested in like how do we apply it to maybe like things that don't actually exist, like I've seen like werewolves and vampires and whatnot, then I think there's a lot of freedom there to do your own thing. I remember that I think Anne Rice in an interview once, she said that like my vampires are bisexual because they don't conform to human rules. Like it's a different thing for them, and so you have the freedom to do that with your own kind of otherworldly creatures, or honestly whatever you want to do. Really, like I know that's not necessarily a super satisfying answer, but it really depends on like what the themes and like what kind of story do you want to tell. Like do you want like oppression, discrimination to be in your story, or do you want it to not? Where like where does the conflict come from? Like that's a preference.
Friday, kind of what is your take on the question of romance is hard, other cultures is hard? It gets particularly complicated when we decide to discuss the union of those two.
Absolutely. It is. That's why we have setting books. Yeah. And that's what's so interesting, I think, about the exploration of other settings and other cultures is like you want to learn more about it, but then also you want to kind of explore it in your own way, in a safe way. One of the problems with exploring another setting, as has been perhaps subtly pointed out by Sebastian, is like, maybe the conditions for peasants fucking wasn't so great. Is that a good play experience? That's the first question I normally ask is like, if I have romance in my game, would it be a good play experience? Or would it just be like extremely oppressive for one type of player at the table? And if the answer is yes, then probably not a great experience for them, depending on their sensibilities or whether or not they want that. I don't necessarily think that I would have a fun time running a game in a very like colonial America Puritan situation where women were treated the way that they were. You know what I mean? I wouldn't enjoy that style of thing. So I think maybe there's some things that even if you do have a setting like that and you want to kind of adhere to that aesthetically and culturally, maybe you set it aside or keep everything veiled for the more uncomfortable topics. And that's why we do use lines and veils to like keep those things from impacting your enjoyment of the game. Because if you do want to explore like an impressive environment or a very different environment from you, maybe you do have some hangups about it and you just want to explore certain aspects of the romance. Like maybe you want a more Bridgerton style romance that doesn't actually focus on the fact that women didn't have agency. You know what I mean? So I think that's something to consider foremost is always what is the actual play experience going to be for the players? Are they going to feel as though they have choices? I think that's always the number one thing for these games is like we play these games for choices. And if you're taking away their choices, it's normally not very fun for them.
But it kind of sounds like the step zero is to be like, look at your culture, figure out what the role of romance was, figure out what the role of partnering was. Because in some cultures, marriage is a notably practical consideration, that the idea of a love marriage, the people being married because they were super into each other, is kind of just this alien phenomenon, but either due to cultural or business or political expediencies, that's why your kids got together.
Yeah.
The next question is, what themes kind of fall out of that? Duty, obligation, lust, and so on. And do we want those to be centered in the game? And kind of once you've done that, that's where you get to depart. That is the moment where you get to say, well, we really don't care about the machinations of the 14th century Catholic Church, for instance. So we're going to make it this other thing. Or I am not comfortable with the notion, for instance, of arranged marriages being at the forefront of society. So we are going to make this intentional departure to move from there. That seems to kind of be that step zero. This is a game, and role-playing games are advanced storytelling, and that kind of implies systems. Sebastian, what were kind of the systems or tools or bits that are brought that make this a game?
We do have broadly, so my system, as I mentioned, is one for the GMs to track romance, and also guidance on how to play a romanceable NPC, everything from how to create one, and also how to like introduce them and how to keep hitting those kind of narrative beats so that the romance progresses. We have one for serenades and gifts. We have a dating system, we have a beef system, and we have an intimacy system. I don't know, Friday, did I miss any?
No, you got them all. So we have the book itself is broken up into three major sections, and the section that Sebastian is talking about is the design section that we have, and that is really like the mechanical stuff. Like, here is the tool for the GM to use to run all of those things. So you would use a character sheet, a romance tracker that Sebastian is made for everyone, and they would be tracking, like, how does this relationship progress? How does it affect their relationship throughout the campaign? And then you have a dating system, which is, how do I run a date as a GM? How do I do this in a way where I'm going to meet them in the middle to have as much fun as possible in the time allotted, and include people as best they can, and then also like make it fun? And then you have the serenade system, which is to create any sort of creative thing that is going to woo the other person, whether that be gifts or poetry or songs or whatever it might be. And that is kind of a bare bones take of like, hey, we have some examples here. Here's how you would actually construct something like this and design this and craft this and tweak this a little bit to be meaningful to the player character, because it was given to them in such a way that was specific to them, rather than pulling some poem from the internet or ChatGPT or wherever and thinking that that's going to do it. And like, it's better to teach the GM, how do I specifically tailor this if I'm going to make this a special experience? In addition to like, I kind of like that name, the beef system. Maybe I'll rename the dispute system to the beef system. Initially, I was calling it the breakup system, and that's my section that I'm writing in the book. But I was thinking that calling it the breakup system would actually make it very railroaded to that outcome. Really, it is a dispute system when people fight. And like I said, that's my favorite part of running romance, is when you have a disagreement. And how does that work? And how do you make that fun in a way? And so on and so forth. And then we have an intimacy system, which is written by such prepared and qualified individuals such as Alex Roberts. That covers everything from flirting to actual sex. So you have everything in the middle. And that is not to say that you would necessarily run any of those things in the intimacy system, like in front of your table. Maybe you do it privately. Maybe it's a message. Maybe it's, something that you feel comfortable with and within the boundaries of each other agree to. And that's just one section in the book. We have an advice section from some of the top GMs in the industry and professionals. And then we have I'm calling it a splat section for now, but it's basically like the additional stuff that you might want to pull from in order to include in your game. Like everything from date scenarios and locations and NPCs, conversation and dialogue and gifts and stuff that you can like kind of pull from, maybe tweak a little bit, and then put it in your game within like a minute or two.
And again, this is a game, so obviously we want people who are sufficiently interested to go out and acquire the text, but kind of as a sampling. Sebastian or Friday, is there one system that you would be comfortable kind of giving us a little bit of a walkthrough for? Maids of the Ascension is a game of wizards being catty bitches. Anyone who says otherwise, I think, is fundamentally lying. So I'm particularly fascinated by the beef system because breakup is far too formal and adversary is far too formal. They're beefs. The phenomenon of bitch eating crackers, I think, is well documented and comes up in a lot of games. So, Sebastian or Friday, is there one system where you'd be comfortable giving us kind of just a walkthrough of what it does, especially to kind of give us the contrast to the alternative of having no system?
So the system that I'm doing, it will be familiar to anyone who has played an RPG in which like romance features. So, I'm talking like anything from, Dragon Age and Baldur's Gate to a dating sim. It runs on a kind of tracker, so there is like an approval score, and there are certain things that you can do to increase and decrease approval. But what I want to do is I wanted to add some kind of nuance to that and say that actually having very high disapproval does not mean that you can't have a romance. You can have some kind of enemies and lovers situation, which I think is potentially very spicy. And then I think it kind of adds this dimension where you have to go in with your character and you have to think, wait, so what is the attraction here, and why am I so sort of fascinated by this person who I absolutely can't stand? Like there's a base level of respect that I have for them, but like, what do I do with it? But the system itself is relatively like numerically straightforward, and there are options to modify it. And so if you're comfortable without using numbers, then you can just kind of go based on vibes. There's a section where I've kind of broken down the possible attitudes. So like, there's hostile, that's kind of very high disapproval, like scornful, cold, neutral, warm, friendly, and enamored. And I've given some pointers as to how a GM might convey that emotion as opposed to just coming out and saying, oh, like this NPC is hostile to you, sort of thing. So like that's the tracker, and then there is a separate kind of romance sheet, which is like a supplementary character sheet. And so that asks the GM to fill in like, values, insecurities. Like you have to really know this character and understand how they would react to any given thing in the game. And so it encourages the GM to flesh out like their likes, their dislikes, their values, and how does that affect their opinion of someone when they witness the player characters doing things that support or contradict those values. It's a system for like it's a step-by-step thing that the GM can use to track. And then the idea is that once they've kind of gotten used to thinking about characters in that way, then it will come naturally to them.
Yeah, and to tie into what Sebastian is saying about that, if we talk about any of the other systems in the book, I'll briefly talk about Kiana's section, which is the dating system. And this is probably what most people are kind of wondering about, is like, okay, well, how does a date work? Well, the way that we have presented it, and there's no one way for a date to work really, but the way that we have presented it is that there's an initial meeting, there's a first sparks kind of thing. And this could happen at a first meeting, this could happen later on. And that is the reason why someone would choose to go on a date with someone. How do you manage that? How does that actually occur after the first sparks have been like kind of struck there? And then we move on to the actual date itself. We go from the invitation to before the date itself, and then the conclusion. And tying into the romance tracker is the date system, in which we are taking our practical play and we're reflecting it on the sheet so that these things matter long term. And these things can still occur if you're not on good terms, as Sebastian has pointed out. For instance, you could end up on a date with somebody because that's what the circumstances were, and you were just kind of like, I don't want to say coerced, as long as the player is okay and consenting, because they could do something they don't want to do when their player character doesn't want to do it, but they're okay with it as a player. And then they could come out of that relationship feeling worse or better about the date and the person that they are with, and so on and so forth. And affecting those things is really like the core of the system. And Sebastian is really the core of this system, is the tracker and how you affect it in various ways. So if you want to look at like what is the heart of the book, it's like really Sebastian's section, making sure that we are giving these players the agency to affect this thing, but then also honoring those choices.
So it seems to be the approach that it is doing something a la Fate or Fiasco, where the basic unit isn't necessarily the character, but the relationship. It is almost unimportant in a game of Fiasco who I am and who you are, but the way we interact with each other is notionally the important part. The fact that we are family is more important than what my day job is and kind of what your day job is. So it seems to be the case that this abstracts the relationship so it is a thing unto itself. And games do that in any number of ways, where the city may be a character, or the desert may be a character that we're attempting to deal with and cross, and it may have seemingly its own wants and goals. Are there things that we don't think of as dates that for the purposes of this system are? In the same way that an argument could be viewed as another type of combat, it just generally doesn't use swords. Are the things where you're like, yeah, you may not have romance as a key thing, but this date system is super useful to portray this. Or at the end of the day, we could view this set of social interactions as fundamentally basically being dates, even though we don't call them that. Kind of, Sebastian, are there any ideas that you have about either, one, the technology of the relationship having its own character sheet, or kind of the date as a more expansive type of human interaction than we think of as two people going to a mediocre Italian restaurant to see if they like each other?
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, in that sense, so for the romance tracker, for my section at least, it can, like, if you don't necessarily want to use it for romantic purposes, you don't have to. It can just be a way to track interactions, and it can still be very useful for that in like an everyday kind of sense. I am less familiar with the dating aspect, but there are definitely ways that you could just apply these to the ways that the characters interact with each other and keep track of it. And so like it would be a useful tool for that. It's just that for the purposes of this book, it assumes that like the person who has picked it up is a GM who is interested in doing romance, and so we framed everything that way. But it doesn't necessarily have to be. And so like for whatever reason, if you kind of read it and you find these tools helpful for other situations in your game, then yeah, you're more than welcome to use them for that.
And absolutely, it is the case that if you, for whatever reason, if you're just, I think we've all met these types of people. I think me and my girlfriend are these people ourselves, but like sometimes you have a dispute and then you come out a lot more fonder for each other afterward, you know? So it's like some people like to fight, and that is how they build their relationship, and they just like to, bicker a little bit because that's like kind of how they are or how they were raised or like where they're comfortable. So there is that nuance in it that, sometimes the dispute system leads to a closer relationship and it's not necessarily leading to breakup. And I think that sort of is dynamicism a word? That dynamic approach is important to recognizing player agency in that way.
But it seems like this could be a starting point if you wanted to have a politics system or an agenda system, or the ability to coerce or induce someone to do something. My chantry and your chantry getting together to form a new, larger chantry is a type of romance. It just may lack some of the romantic aspects of things. There may be a political expediency to it. But so it seems like this is a starting point for anyone who wants to have a game where relationships are going to be the fundamental unit of account, or is kind of the core thing, and we want a way to have everything point at it. One of the nice things about hit points is they are unambiguous. Generally, when you have 0, you are dead. And a lot of other types of interactions in RPGs have the difficulty of, well, how do I know how I'm doing? And this seems to present a way of saying, I'm at this end of the spectrum, I'm at that end of the spectrum. We all have an idea of where things stand. Even if ultimately things don't turn out the way you want them to, there was something at the table where everyone had the ability to go, yeah, this kind of seems reasonable at every step of the journey. You had made mention, I think Friday or Sebastian, that there were kind of beats to how a romance story tends to happen. The phrase initial sparks was used. Can someone give a brief outline of what those steps are? So even if someone doesn't go out and buy GMing romance, just something they should have in the back of their head where we say, within the Western canon, this is generally how romance happens.
I think for me, it's about the build up of the relationship. I know that Friday mentioned that trust between the players is a really big one, but also establishing in the fiction the trust between the characters, or at least like how much information the characters know about each other, how that's revealed, and how to kind of reveal that in a compelling way. Like maybe if you're playing D&D, you can roll insight and be like, oh, this person is super nervous and they're trying to cover it up. And then, that kind of gives you a bit of a window into what they're feeling. Like those beats are, like, how do you introduce that NPC? How do you make it so that these characters, if it is an NPC and a player character, how do you make it so that there are recurring chances to meet? And if it's two player characters, how do we give them the space to play out scenes together and to get to know one another more?
Yeah, absolutely. I start with the question, what are you looking for? But whether it be like a regular game or whether it be like an erotica game, I always start with the question, what are you actually looking for? And just having that frank conversation, you don't even have to have it like verbally. You can send them a Google form. Like you can,
And just to clarify, Friday,
yeah.
is the you here the character or the player or both?
The player.
Okay.
The player. I always start with the player because I want to make sure that I am understanding where the boundaries are. Because someone might change their mind about what they're into, but I want an agreement up front about what they're looking for so that there's no bigger issue with consent. You know what I mean? If I'm going to run a romance, I want to run the type of romance that they're looking for and that the table is comfortable with. Like if someone comes to me and tells me that they want like kind of a fairy tale-esque PG Disney romance, that's completely different than like something where you're fighting constantly and you get into bar fights with your significant other and stuff like that. Like that is totally different type of thing. So it's just, if you're looking for friends to long-term romance or chance meetings, totally different type. So I start with the player.
And do you provide that hierarchy or a classification scheme that says, hey, you may be used to this type of romance, but
right.
in the full panoply of human experience, let's recognize that frenemies is a distinct phenomenon, or
right.
I hate you so much, I am DTF is a distinct phenomenon. Do you provide those basics?
I do. I like to ask the best question for people is because we're so used to those, who play games and such like, we're so used to explaining what media we like. And what media we like is very tied into what we're interested in role playing. So I ask them normally, like, what type of romances are you interested in or have you seen in media that you think would be fun? That's what I start with. And then I start to get into the nuts and bolts from there, because if you start with something that's familiar in their communication, then you're going to get a much better answer and get to the point quicker than asking them what are they looking for. Because if you ask them what they're looking for normally like that, they're just going to be like, I don't know. Or not at all. But if you ask them like, hey, are you looking for like we're playing like a Marvel Avengers game or something, right? And you're all superheroes. Are you looking for like are you looking for more of a Natalie Portman situation? Or are you looking for more of a Guardian of the Galaxy's people, Chris Pratt and I forget the name. Zoe? Anyway.
Oh, Zoe Saldana.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So it's like it's one of those things where framing things in ways that they can actually communicate at first, if they're uncomfortable with romance, is more important than getting the terminology of whatever advanced romantic situation that you are more familiar with. Get down to their level and figure out what are they comfortable with and what are they actually seeking with references that they know.
So your recommendation is kind of to start with media references. What are inter-character dynamics in the media landscape that you find compelling, and how can we approximate those within our game? Whether or not that can actually be done is going to be a different question. Courtly romance can only exist in a world where there are courts. The tension between an arranged marriage and a love marriage is only going to exist in a society that has a notion of, I don't pick my partner, my parents do, or the community figures out what the best pairing is going to be. So that kind of seems like that is your recommended starting point. And Sebastian, if you know, what to you are kind of the beats of a romance when you're like, okay, we're going to give this a try. Our step 0 is going to be the introduction or the meet cute or the misunderstanding. Does GMing romance kind of give guidelines on what those steps can be? Because again, if you're not used to talking about or running romance, the actual steps may be utterly alien to you, especially if you're a person who met the love of your life in high school and you have now been married to them for 20 years. The contrivance that we normally associate with romance may not be a thing. Does this kind of give those recommendations?
I would say it does. Yeah. Like throughout the book, there's going to be examples of play. So not only is it going to show you how to use the various systems in the book, it's going to show you, like, through this example scene, here is a scene that you could play out. And here's the context of the scene and the wider narrative of the romance. So, step by step, I'm not sure necessarily. It really does depend, again, on the kind of story that you want to tell and, how turbulent you want this relationship to be. But there will definitely be plenty of examples of the kinds of scenes and the kinds of interactions that are available. And hopefully people will read the book and be like, oh, I really liked how this scene was written, and we'll try to implement that into their game. Like I do think that like as you said, like it's advanced storytelling. So I think that the people who will read this book like have a good sense of what makes a good story and what's right for their story. So, if they want to, they can kind of take inspiration from these scenes that we'll include.
And it seems to be the case that RPGs take turns presenting a simple thing as being remarkably complicated, romance, and taking a complicated thing and making it overly simple. So, for instance, a game may have a political agenda system where I don't need to press the flesh and argue with people and do the horse trading. Just every 3 sessions, I roll my intelligence plus politics, and I get to see if my agenda is being advanced. So to me, it is always interesting looking at an RPG and saying, what are we making too hard compared to how it seemingly works in the real world, and what are we really simplifying beyond the point of all reason? And that kind of brings me to my last class of questions, which is to say, Maids of the Ascension is an urban fantasy game, so we get to have the phenomenon of a fairy being super into a wizard who's in a weird polycule with a vampire that includes a love triangle with a werewolf. Do you provide any insight on how to deal with views of romance that are alien, other, or at least fundamentally different?
Yes, we do. So that would be in our splat section. So we are going to provide some irregular examples, let's call them, some non-human examples. I think those are kind of interesting and kind of if for immediate reference, that's like a Star Trek style of storyline in which we are exploring much different ways of life than our own and how they interact with the human experience. And I think that's a very interesting way to approach things as far as like telling a romantic story. We're not necessarily focusing on providing as much splat as we are providing the other things. Like this is more of it's going to be approximately a 200-page book, so we can't provide like examples for everything, of course. But I think that as long as you are talking to your players about what they want, essentially, then you can kind of explore a story like that for sure. The thing that I would caution people about is that if you aren't upfront about how different it's going to be, then that can be a bad play experience for someone. Because if you are coming in with the understanding of what a werewolf is, and the player doesn't have an understanding of how a werewolf is normally going to be, they might find it frustrating if you are presenting that in a way that can be potentially harmful to their character.
So it seems to be the case that if we're going to discuss a supernatural type, it really needs to come down to what to you is the key aspect of it. So for instance, we could present fairies in a game, and one could say that the key aspect of fairies is a tie to myth. Another one could be a fluid relationship with the notion of time. Another one may be one of the last remaining bastions of courtly romance. Another one could be a system of geishas, promises, and filial ties that we in the Western world just aren't used to. Like, oh, you would never date this person. They're a Capulet or something like that. So it seems to be the case that if we're going to introduce romance across lines, the first step is to figure out what themes and ideas does this creature type put forward in our game, and then how does that bear on romance? Is that kind of a reasonable way of putting it?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it is about understanding, like, I'm not even necessarily sure that this has more to do with the creatures being non-human or otherwise, like, or otherwise atypical. It's more like, you have to understand them as characters and establish what kind of culture that they're coming from. So, I mean, I would think about it that way. And so if they have, like, particularly, I don't know, monstrous features, or if they are able to fly, then you can say, well, how does this feature affect the way that they interact with the universe and how they see the world and that kind of thing. And so like that can be built in culturally. But for me, it just is having an understanding of them as a character.
That seems like the difference that we're talking about is like it's a psychology story instead of a sociological story. So I believe you're coming at it from the aspect of a sociological story, like what happens typically when two people from disparate cultures and or beliefs and or makeups interact with each other. Kind of an interesting, different dynamic. But I think that overall, the way that we are approaching it with the book is for sure like very individual.
Yeah, because it really feels like there's three aspects of it. There's the individual aspects, there's the cultural aspects, and then there's, for lack of a better term, what I'm going to call the biological aspect of it. So, for instance, if there is something in the makeup of a vampire that makes them view a short-term relationship as something that is under 200 years, I feel like that's something that's going to be reflected in the game. And likewise, to the sociological question, it seems to make sense that a first date for two werewolves may be to hunt out corruption in the area that their pack has particular say over, which is not something that I, as an actuary, would probably do as a first date. So I feel as if those kind of are the three legs of that stool. But needless to say, it provides input on that. The last area where games, and this is one of those things where immediately my finger just shoots towards the metaphorical X card at the center of our table when this comes up. Mage the Ascension is a game that has the Mind Sphere. Vampire is a game that is partially defined by the powers Dominate and Presence. How can we help navigate the interface between kind of, for lack of a better term, coercion and romance?
Yeah, so I think it depends on whether or not that's an above table discussion. And honestly, like those themes can be present in the game in really interesting ways. And so honestly, if the player is down for it, then then why not? But you have to figure out again like this theme of kind of consent and establishing parameters as to how that works. Like a lot of game systems have some level of mind control or like a loss of character agency. And for me, it's establishing like, will this be interesting to the story? How is that going to affect my character? And will that be fun for me to explore that? So, you can take away the character's agency, but once the player feels like that their agency is taken away, then that's when it no longer becomes fun. But it's about having like those conversations and trusting in each other to respect those kind of boundaries that you've set, and as a kind of constant communication of, well, maybe something in your life changes and a previously stated boundary is different now, and so you kind of have to be like, there has to be an ongoing conversation.
I think as a vampire storyteller myself, I do run a decent amount of Vampire Chronicles. I have found that players are drawn to generally the game system that best supports, if they know about it at least, that supports really the type of stories that they're trying to tell. And vampire players in general are more open to those elements of coercion and those elements of like mind control and things like that. And I'm sure the same is true of Mage. I've never run Mage, but based on what you told me about the themes, I'm like, okay, so if someone reads this book and understands the primer on what this game is, they're going to be like, cool, I would love to get fucked up by insert NPC. You know what I mean? Like that, they have sort of like consented to the themes, right? But it's still important, as Sebastian says, to go over that with the player individually, because they could like completely different aspects of the game than other players. And there are certain players who enjoy those aspects, but then they feel like they're trapped once they're in that oppressive relationship and they feel like they can't get out, so they just quit the game. So that is why I try my best to convey early, often, and during. I have a few specific ground rules that I run. I ask for consent outside of the game space. I don't do it during a game, meaning that I do not run anything I have not asked for consent for. So if I'm going to introduce a relationship that is personal in that way, if the player has not initiated it, then I don't do it in that respect, because as we talked about, like sex and intimacy and things like that are much more personal and very difficult for people to deal with when it goes awry. And then when I am running a relationship of some kind, I check in with the player in the middle when we're on break, and then afterward, and then I get feedback if they need it. And then I make sure that that door is open, because oftentimes a player who has an issue doesn't, if they're new to you and they're not as comfortable for you, or they don't know what their feelings are, which is a common experience in romance, especially if like you're playing this character and you don't really know how to feel about it and you don't really know how your feelings are, or they could feel good about it in the moment. And then the next day they wake up and they're thinking back on it and they're like, ah, that was kind of gross. They can feel that way, and that's okay to feel that way. And making sure that I communicate to people that they can always tell me those things is going to lead people to feel like they can actually pursue those relationships because they feel comfortable enough to tell me when they want it to stop. And when I tell people that they can make it stop at any point by giving them the option to X out of the relationship, I don't punish them for doing that. I say, I'm going to scalpel this out of the game with that and leave everything else intact. Maybe I just take the NPC out if they're not important to anything else. But like if you've like started a relationship with this older vampire who obviously has power over you in this political sphere, and this, you know, they can potentially do stuff to you physically that you wouldn't like, you know what I mean? Maybe they're stronger. It's important to be very upfront about that as the GM. And because you're talking about like something that they have been vulnerable in front of other people at the table, and then they'll feel taken advantage of in front of other people in a way that isn't consensual. So it's just important to check in often. I do consent checks a lot for whenever I'm running that sort of thing. And I don't always get it right. If you make a mistake, you make a mistake. And then you can't undo the mistake. You just can try to do better. Or you can say, hey, I'm sorry, you apologize, mean the apology, and then you move forward doing better, more aligned with what would work better. Sometimes you discover that certain players thought that they were going to like something, and then they didn't, even though you gave them exactly what they wanted. And that's okay, because sometimes they're just exploring it, or they weren't feeling up to it that week. And that happens a lot, actually, if someone is having a stressful week and stuff, and they're like, this stressful ass relationship with Irina is like killing me, because instead of coming to the game wanting to play, now I'm worried about the relationship and it's killing the fun of the game. And I would much rather keep the player in the game than have them stress about the relationship in a way that's not fun. So with everything to do with like stressful horror games and stuff like that, a lot of my players call it recreational anxiety when I run horror games, because that's like what it essentially is, right? So it's, if they show up to the game and like they're kind of dreading it, but then at the same time they're excited, that's fun, right? But if they're just dreading it, like that's not a fun environment for them. And I want to know that so that I can make sure to keep running that game for them.
Sebastian, do you have anything to add to that? Or alternatively, is there something about romance and RPGs shedding light on the relationships we have in our lives? For instance, one of the things that occurred to me in what Friday just said was, I'm 6'2" and I weigh 320 pounds. The odds of me ever having a romantic partner that I feel physically threatened by is quite low. Whereas I could be a remarkably puissant mage, but if a Methuselah has taken a shining to me, that changes everything. Is there a way in which you feel that adding romance to our RPGs can improve us kind of as people?
I'd like to think so, but also, in a way, like, life imitates art, right? So if you do go through this kind of negotiation of boundaries, then you do kind of learn to see people in a new light. And I do hope that fundamentally that would change your respect for others and kind of how you interact with people outside of the game. Because like there does have to be this kind of base level of understanding and a willingness to participate in the process, which includes all of the stuff that all of the facilitation and the discussions. So yes, but I would like to think so, but that's also not necessarily within the purview of my role with the book. I'm not really I don't think I don't presume to think that I can make people into kinder people, but
perfectly reasonable. Friday, do you have anything to add to that? Or alternatively, if there isn't anything that is in the book that we haven't had a chance to at least kind of poke at, that someone would be like, oh, I didn't think this was in here. What is the call to action? If we are interested in this, how do we get the darn book?
Yeah, so I dare to believe, I'm just kidding. So I think my self-exploration has been really good through role-playing. It's really opened me up to queerness. I wouldn't say that makes me a better person. I just think that makes me more self-aware, and self-awareness is good and that's why I think a lot of us are drawn to role-playing games, is like not to make it virtuous or whatever, but it's like we enjoy media to explore other perspectives. That's why we play role-playing games as well. So I think it is fun in that way. And I think in some cases, unfortunately, like for instance, when like some of the not great things have happened to me with lack of consent and stuff like that, it really opened my eyes up to that because I'm a big bitch, Terry. I get it. Like I'm a 250-pound power lifter who did martial arts for 10 years. Like nobody's fucking with me. But the point is that like there are so many different perspectives in the world and it's important to humanize them. And you may see someone like yourself, Terry, as someone who's very like tough and like big and stuff, but you could still be, have a soft little heart in there. You could have feelings that matter. And I think one of the things also that is important with a lot of masculine people who play these role-playing games, it's like they're taught culturally in Western society that they shouldn't have feelings, that they shouldn't express what they want, that they shouldn't be this and that. And a lot of these masculine players that I have personally dealt with and anecdotally is that they discover that their feelings are very raw the first time that they start to explore this because they haven't even done this in an environment with like their real life partners when they're exploring romance because they have a place where they're not going to be judged for that. So that's, I think, one of the major benefits of it, I would say. I don't think it makes people better people, but I do think it's a nice tool to enjoy the game and to enjoy the game in a way that's meaningful to each person individually. And it's still on Backerkit, so you can pre-order it if you want. And one of the great things about it's supporting small indie publishers and creator studios and things like that. We are partnered with Metal Weave Games for this, and they're our publisher. I just run the creator studio. And I think that if you're going to put your money into something and you want the hobby to expand and grow and things like that, I personally think it is virtuous to support indie games and indie projects and things that you believe, because then you'll see more of that. Because at the other end of these projects are these people that are creating different things than you've seen before.
We are always constantly in the position of voting with our wallets. And as you mentioned, RPGs fundamentally are an exercise in empathy if done correctly. For a brief period of time, we put away the contrivances of modernity and we choose to step into someone else's shoes. And a willingness to engage in that with other people, to me, can't but help to improve our capacity for empathy or at least sympathy. And to add that in such a fundamental arena of human interaction as romance, it really makes you wonder, why hadn't this been done already? Why did it take to the year of our Lord 2024 to have this come about as a thing? Sebastian, is there anything about this project that you were particularly proud of, or alternatively that people who grab it may be surprised to see something about it? Or alternatively, if we're interested in knowing what you're up to, how can we do that?
About this project, I really love the art because our art director is the incredible Nala Wu. They have a very solid vision for what they want this book to look like. The representation and the diversity of relationships and of characters being represented is really, really cool. And the aesthetic is just really, really gorgeous. And they have this vision that it's going to go from like a red palette all the way through to like a purple palette as you get through the book. So I'm really excited to see what all of that will look like once it's all laid out. But the art that I've seen so far, I know that they've been sharing it, has been really incredible, and we're working with some really great artists, so that is just an aspect of the book that if you open it up, then it'll be very pleasant to see. As for me myself, you can find me on Twitter at Sebastian Yūe, and my website is sebastianyue.ca because I'm based in Canada. But thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, gladly. It is always interesting to see a book that recognizes that women above the age of 40 exist and that people with a BMI above 35 are alive and in the world.
There are fat characters. It's great. Yeah, there are disabled characters. It's all good.
Friday, what about this project were you particularly tickled by, and how can we find out what you're up to?
This started as an idea between me and Kiana 2 years ago now, and it's been a long road to get here. We're through the campaign now. I'm so excited, and I feel so honored to be working with so many professionals in the space whom I admire, and I've just wanted to work with, and I'm so happy that they agreed to come on the project. And it's really something that I feel like fulfills me to do the work of, and it's what I wanted to do in the industry. And so I'm just really grateful for the experience and for the ability to do this. So everyone taking their time to not only work on the book, but everyone who embraces it and shares it and buys it, of course, that just feels great to me. I can't describe how that feels. Just as a creative, it's wonderful. And I'm very thankful for that. So I think that one of the things that I wanted to emphasize most or get into the most when I got into the industry was working with people who are smarter than me. And one of those people is Sebastian here. So working with Sebastian, of course, is like really wonderful because I love to learn from people who are better at me than stuff. And that has been like my personal, like my selfish takeaway has been I'm learning so fast because I work with all these really incredible people all the time. I'm a self-improvement junkie, but I don't watch Joe Rogan videos so anymore. So it's one of those things. For the Backerkit, we'll have to, I guess you'll post a link of the Backerkit, so you won't need that.
Link in the
If
show
you're
notes.
looking, yeah, if you're looking for me personally, I run a newsletter and podcast where you can find all my links and everything like that on dollarsanddragons.com. And that is where you can find like some advice about pro GMing. It's an industry podcast. So it's like if you like to hear about people talking about TTRPG and like what it is to be a designer or an artist or a pro GM in the space, that's like what the podcast is. It's been running for a couple years now, so not as many episodes as you, Terry, but we're getting there. So, but yeah, that's where you can find me. I really appreciate coming on the show. This has been great, a wonderful experience. Thank you.
Gladly. Sebastian, Friday, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, anytime. Thank you.
This has been Maids the Podcast, where our biggest romantic question is, would you make out with your co-located self? You know, if they were into it. The show has been brought to you by our executive producers. You can join them at patreon.com/maidstthepodcast. First, we have the Oracle of the following maids dating difficulties. Ben Bendelow, Oracle of the Akashic, who seems really into your past lives. Buck Gregory, Oracle of the Chorister, who thinks you're the one. Christopher Phillips, Oracle of the Ecstatic Chantry, which is kind of a package deal. Guy Stewart, Oracle of the Titlein, who says whoever loses at Curtimane needs to cover the cost of the check. Jay Widener, Oracle of the Euthanatoi, who asks about your criminal record a bit too insistently. Mikhail, Oracle of the Aetheryte, who considers Hollow Earth a nice date location. Pukaji, Oracle of the Dream Speaker, whose stories all start with In a Time Before Legend. Sean Gallagher, Oracle of the Hollower, who always looks like they're ready for a date. Crew of Erebus, Oracle of the Verbena, who says you need more plants, and bring some over, and then those plants attack you. St. UX Player, Oracle of the Iterator, who offers to make dinner, which is just a creative soylent. Jason Vines, Oracle of the Void Engineer, who offers to take you back to their place over interstellar distances. Derek Semsek, Oracle of the NWO Agent, who seems surprisingly familiar with your browser history. Drawn Cap, Oracle of the Syndicate Mage, who buys lobster every time but wants to split the check evenly. And Melissa Krause, Oracle of the Moment of Concern when a progenitor asks if you have any pet allergies. Along with Archmaster Andrea Edelstein, Archmaster Brad the Blue, Archmaster Dan Svensson, Archmaster Leroy Bryce, Archmaster Morgan Aran, Archmaster Nathan Weaver, Alex, Alexia, Ambiversion, Anders S., Anon, Badurfi, Berto, Blaze Hibbert, Blake Ryan, Brandon, Bryce Perry, Bubba the Pale One, Chris Blake, Sinjotis, Sig, Daniel Cuppen, Daniel Scribner, Darren Hennessy, David McFall, David Roy, Dennis Osborne, Eli Levenger, Eric Schwenk, Fragger Rock, George Lara, Gray Trellick H., Henry Kraft, Ia Bull, Jason Duncan, Jason Kennedy, Jason W. Briggs, Jake Gatsby, Jeff Bryn, Jenna F., Jervis Johnson, John Magnuson, Jolyn Andes, Josh Heath, Joshua Hillerup, Lawson Stuff, Kathleen Halperin, Kevin Fitzpatrick, Chris Kinner, Leslie Weatherstone, Minel Canos, Matthew Prohl, Maurice Hopkins, Michael Creedle, Michael Parker, Nip Barrow, Neil Patterson, Nikita Klamanoff, Pax Cal, Patrick McNamara, Patrick Mulder, Rachel Race, Ricardo, Richard Bat Brewster, Robart the Robot, Ryan Stray, Rob H., Ryan Kendi, Samuel Tobin, Sev Nessus, Starfish, Stephen Carton, Steve Wynyard, That's Real Neato, Thrice Great, Tyler Bryan, Vincent Hamilton, Walter, William Connolly, William Martin, and Wolf Lyerson. Our EP shoutout is to David McFall, who I assume is simply a fall offered by the McDonald's Corporation. So some of the weird things that they no longer have on the menu. The Hula Burger competed with a McFish to be an item geared towards people who abstained from meat, often thought to be geared towards Catholics who abstain from meat on Fridays during Lent. It consisted of a bun, cheese, and a slice of pineapple. It ultimately lost out to the McFish, which has been on the menu since. The McLean Deluxe, offered from 1991 to 1994, the McLean Deluxe was marketed as a low-fat alternative to regular burgers. It used a lean beef patty mixed with water and seaweed extract to reduce fat content. However, it lacked the flavor customers expected, leading to its failure. Onion nuggets, which were available in the 70s, before the introduction of chicken McNuggets, McDonald's experimented with onion nuggets, which were deep-fried chunks of onion. They didn't catch on, and chicken McNuggets were introduced in 1983 and became the far more successful alternative. And finally, the McStuffins. They were bread rolls stuffed with various fillings like barbecue chicken and teriyaki beef. They were similar to Hot Pockets, but didn't catch on with customers and were discontinued shortly after their launch. When I think of failed McDonald's products, I'll think of you, David. Rather listen on YouTube, search Maids the Podcast on YouTube to find our full library there. If you super like this episode or super didn't, drop us a line at maidsthepodcast@gmail.com or at Maids the Podcast on Twitter. We have a Hop in Discord community at discord.me/maidsthepodcast. If you like us, please give us a review on the platform we're choosing or tell a friend about us. Also go to maidsthepodcast.com for show notes and all of our previous shows. Now go change reality. Bye.